This is Rabbi Jeffrey Sacks, editor of Tradition, with a special episode of our podcast. Together with the rest of the Jewish world and with lovers of wisdom worldwide, I am sorrowful at the untimely loss of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha, who passed away on Shabbat. Rabbi Sacks served as the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth from 1991 to 2013. In 2009, he was made a life peer in the House of Lords, the upper parliamentary body of the United Kingdom. For many worldwide, his influence was felt through his dozens of books, countless essays, as well as his translations and commentaries on the Hebrew Bible and the prayer books, alongside his public speaking and general presence on the world stage. Rabbi Sacks spent a distinguished life and career as a profoundly eloquent teacher and spokesman for Torah values within the Jewish community and throughout the world. I should mention that Rabbi Sacks served as a member of Tradition's editorial board, and in fact, his very first scholarly essay was published in Our Pages in 1973, an essay entitled Alienation and Faith. Remarkably written as a 25-year-old, it was his response and respectful critique of Rabbi Soloveitchik's The Lonely Man of Faith, which we had published only 8 years earlier. Rereading Rabbi Sacks's essay now, you can find it at our archives at traditiononline.org. We can already identify themes and concerns which would occupy him as his mind matured, as his eloquence flourished over the next half century. To help us absorb the shock of his loss and to begin to assess Rabbi Sacks's legacy, I turned to Daniel Reinhold, professor of Jewish philosophy and dean of the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University. Welcome back to the podcast, Daniel.
Thank you.
Before we dig into the philosophy of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, allow me to express my personal condolences. You had a fairly close relationship with him. Tell us about that.
Yes, so going back to when he began as chief rabbi, which was either 1990 or 1991.
Yeah, 1991.
91, right. And at that point, I was an undergraduate studying philosophy, as he had done at Cambridge, as he had done. And was already, thinking about a career that would be in Jewish life, whether in the rabbinate or whether in academia. And I reached out to him for advice and to ask him about the path I should take. And I actually, on hearing of the terrible news, Motzei Shabbat, actually dug out the letter that I received back from him at the time, telling me to follow whichever of those paths I decided, and that led to a relationship over many years. He was actually, at least in name, he was co-mentor for my PhD at the time. He was chief rabbi, so it was it certainly wasn't mentor in the full sense of having to read all my writings, because kind of he had many more things on his plate. But yeah, that led to a relationship that really profoundly influenced me, and I don't think I would be doing what I do today were it not for him. More than that, I was just one of many. Rabbi Sacks used to invite a whole group of young educators, Jewish communal workers, who were all probably early 20s and still in education or just starting out, to his house, to the chief rabbi's residence, Hamilton Terrace, a couple of times a year, just to learn with us, to be with us. And that was profoundly inspiring for all of us. I don't think anybody in that group had such access to somebody in that position, and there was it was very clear the great joy he took in doing that, and I think back to the people around that table and so many of them now are educators, Jewish leaders, rabbis. And so he really did have a profound influence, not just on me, but on so many people of my generation who are now doing things within the Jewish community all over globally.
I doubt that there are any of our listeners who are unfamiliar with Rabbi Sacks's contributions to Jewish life and Jewish learning. But more strictly speaking, from the perspective from your perch in the philosophy department, um, survey for us his interests and his achievements and accomplishments as a thinker, as a philosopher, and how that translated into life on the ground, both in his native Britain and worldwide.
Sure. So there's a line in a book that it was called Radical Then, Radical Now in England. I think here it's called A Letter in the Scroll.
Yes, yes.
Um, and there's a line in there where says Judaism is a protest against the world that is in the name of the world that ought to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really captures the profound moral and political concern that's at the heart of his teachings. So while he began with more classical, I suppose, Jewish fare, so early works like Tradition in an Untraditional Age, where he was looking at the various attempts to synthesize Judaism with the kind of general culture, whether from Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Torah Derech Eretz, to his own formulation of Torah v'Chochmah, or One People, which was written at the beginning of his chief rabbinate, and was really there to address a deep concern in Anglo-Jewry at the time, where there was tremendous denominational strife between different Jewish denominations, and a work that really attempted to address that. It was very difficult. As chief rabbi in England, you are chief rabbi of, or indeed of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, of all Jews. And that can be a difficult place to occupy when you're Orthodox and speaking not just to Orthodox Jews. And actually, One People, the book, therefore, was not accepted entirely by everybody. But the point being that he was there in this position, really trying to address those types of issues and trying to address Jewish unity, I suppose. But that kind of moral, political concern at the heart of even his internal Jewish work would then, as his reputation snowballed, be addressed to broader issues, national and global, where he really used his Jewish learning to inform those issues, with a profound focus on the importance of religious ideas, particularly like that of covenant, to address societal concerns. So, in an early work, The Politics of Hope, second edition of which actually had a preface by Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of England, he talks about the distinction between, on the one hand, the social contract, and the social contract gives rise to the institutions of the state, government and parties, and power, etc. And that's fundamental and important for political society. But what Rabbi Sacks emphasized was that a society cannot function or be created by just political or indeed economic structures alone. And in addition to contract, what we bring to the world, what the Torah brought to the world, is the idea of covenant. And that doesn't give rise to power and government and parties. It gives rise to families and communities and traditions. And those things that create the virtues can only, as far as he's concerned, be sustained and taught in particular institutions and in particular traditions. So he was following this sort of communitarian idea that the particular communal institutions and narratives are essential for creating the kind of virtues without which we just end up with the bare political economic power. And I think what's so important is that what Rabbi Sacks managed to do is emphasize how one can be unapologetically committed to one's own particular religion in a way that still has an eye on how it can affect the global tapestry.
This
So,
kind of
yeah.
the interplay between the particularistic and the universalistic was central to his thought, and something about which others have written about its role in his thinking. And apropos of that dialectic between looking inward and looking outward, could you maybe help us distinguish between his work as a Jewish thinker and as a member of the larger school of Western philosophy? Many of his works are directed inward to the local community, or perhaps even to the local Orthodox Jewish community, and some of them are really directed towards larger concerns. So how is his work absorbed in the larger philosophical world?
So I think probably it's his influence has been, greater in the political sphere and in the sphere of practice rather than in the sphere of scholarship, as he himself often said, and once said to me, look, I can't keep up with the scholarly reading on a particular narrow issue. But I should say there's nobody I've ever met who was as well read
Read.
as Rabbi Sacks, and whenever you would speak to him, he would mention, goodness knows, a list of books, as if you would have read them as well, which of course you then had to say, I haven't yet read that. And you'd go home with an entire list, a reading list. And yeah, so, he just read even more prolifically than he wrote. Um, and it was astounding just how much he absorbed. What that allowed him to do was to really forge a reputation as a kind of, I suppose, a spokesman for kind of for religious for religion, I suppose, in society. So he would be on the BBC, on TV, on radio, and he would be sought after for his opinions on these things, as much, if not more often, than the church representatives who were more ensconced within the political structures than any Jew had ever been. And of course, that led to him being in the House of Lords. Lord Jacobowitz, who preceded him, mind you, was also in the House of Lords and appointed there by Margaret Thatcher, but did not have the same kind of reach as Rabbi Sacks ended up having, where he really, did manage to be a public intellectual for the UK. And his books would be serialized in the London Times when they came out. It's not necessarily something that would happen to, I don't know, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but Chief Rabbi and latterly Lord Sacks, it did. So I think that was really where he made his greatest contribution. And really, genuinely, and I wrote this on a post for Revel yesterday. In terms of a Kiddush Hashem and somebody of whom the entire Jewish community could, say with great pride that he represents us. Rabbi Sacks really, really was.
Mhm. From rabbis and educators that were influenced by him to readers worldwide, who many of whom never met him, but are, in the outpouring of tributes and remembrances to him that we're seeing throughout the internet. to bar mitzvah boys that interacted with him, and then on the other hand to the Dalai Lama and the Pope and the Prince of Wales, the tributes pouring in from one end to the other, from inside to outside, from small to large. We see his impact and the influence that he's left. But I want to ask about this point you raised about his role as a public intellectual. Particularly in the last, it seems to me, particularly in the last decade, and particularly after he stepped down as chief rabbi, he really did occupy this. I'll say rare because there are so few people who have occupied it in the modern world. This Jewish public intellectual at large, uh,
Mm-hmm.
actually spending a number of months a year in the United States, some of that time at your university, at my alma mater,
Mm-hmm.
and elsewhere, traveling the world. It seemed, of course, that his pace of writing and publishing, you just could hardly keep up with it, from significant tomes on larger human concerns, things like ethics, a book about morality that was only just released very recently, science, the conflict between science and faith, and the like, alongside an ongoing flood of Torah teaching, principally on the Parashat HaShavua and other more particular Jewish texts. So this role as public intellectual, which really is you know, somewhat surprisingly, though unusual, that we have people that can occupy that realm. Um, what is that role of public intellectual in in our society, in religious society in particular, and might we ever see the likes of it again?
Um, that I really don't know. He really, Rabbi Sacks was really pretty unique in terms of, a prominent Jew, not only a prominent Jew, but an Orthodox rabbi of great learning, who nonetheless could speak to, whether it's presidents and prime ministers, or just to Amcha, right, everywhere, and not just in England. I mean, I have to say, I think the UK were very proud that from our tiny little place, this kind of really intellectual colossus, was out there, spreading the the voice of reasonable religion in the world.
Mhm.
And in terms of that role of public intellectual, I think that, well, I'll say two things. Number one, you do hear people who are a little bit nowadays, sadly, I think, almost snooty about it, in the academic realm, because academics write very, highly sourced and particularized things. And it's a wonderful thing. I do it myself, but I'll be lucky if 200 people read my books. And I always, admire immensely and can't emphasize just how important it is to have people who are able to get complex ideas out there kind of on a mass basis, um, and communicate those, and as I said, to really act as a, a standard bearer for the significance for us in particular of religion and Judaism out there in the world. There was something, I don't recall the line exactly, but that after 9/11, where Rabbi Sacks was desperate to ensure that, as he puts it, if religion can't be part of the solution, it's going to be part of the problem, and really tried with the work, The Dignity of Difference, to emphasize just how important the religious voice is in these very important and in conversations that are going to affect the world literally. And academics writing their articles aren't going to do that. They're not going to be that voice. And that
That's the
those
role of the public
ideas,
intellectual.
yeah, those are the ideas that people like Rabbi Sacks presented so powerfully. And it really, it's just, obviously, other than the personal loss to Lady Elaine and his kids and family. The loss to the Jewish world, just in terms of having someone of that standing able to present, so powerfully important ideas about values that are often sorely lacking in political discourse today. It really is a loss.
A teacher of mine once observed that the conventional understanding of philosophy as something abstruse or something impractical or something merely theoretical is a mistake. If
Mm-hmm.
done properly, there's nothing more practical, more actionable than philosophy, and he certainly embodied that. I was lurking today on a conversation on Facebook with somebody here in Israel, writing in Hebrew, reflecting on his worldwide impact, bemoaned the fact that he thought that Israel, the religious Zionist community in Israel, could never produce a Jonathan Sacks. And he said this to be the writer, perhaps was trying to be provocative and was trying to generate a conversation. And I didn't respond, but I thought to say, well, in other words, it's an irrelevant conversation to say that Israel could produce someone like him, or the United States, or England. I doubt that any place could produce a Jonathan Sacks if you set out to engineer such a thing. When you have a once in a generation or a once in a century a figure, well, it's going to pop up wherever it's going to pop up. But that being said, what do you think about the spiritual, intellectual, communal milieu which did generate a Jonathan Sacks? What is it about the British Jewish experience that led to creating, helping to form someone like him?
That's a very difficult question. I'm yeah, I'm not entirely sure, to be perfectly honest. Um, it's
I mean, it's possible that we can never decipher the secret sauce. We'll
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that is different in Anglo-Jewry, and I don't know if this maybe contributes to that, um, but in Anglo-Jewry and Anglo-Jewish Orthodoxy, um, the United Synagogue, which is the kind of central body of Orthodoxy in England, and the chief rabbi is kind of comes out of that. Um, Organization, collection of synagogues, um, remains an Orthodox institution that still has many members that are at shul every Shabbat who aren't necessarily practically Orthodox in the way that is the case in America. So when I came to America, and you go to an Orthodox shul in certainly round here, in the
New York
tri-state
area.
area,
But
yeah, in the
once
New
upon a
Jersey
time,
area.
once upon a time, it was different in the United States. But today, by and large, it's not the case.
Right. So in the UK, it still is, and ever it was. So and this is purely speculative, but I guess you wonder whether, therefore, the ability to reach out beyond to people who aren't like you, including Jews who aren't like you, is built into the kind of the DNA from the very beginning, because you're at shul and at school with people who are Jewish but aren't kind of identical to you in the way that they practice that Judaism, that immediately, you know, leads you to find a voice that speaks beyond your own narrower community. And it's a very, like I say, very difficult question. But I wonder if that maybe contributes. I don't know.
It's interesting. Well, it's Tarikh Iyun Gadol. We'll have to see
Indeed.
about that. But before we conclude, is there any uh, vignette or anecdote or remembrance that comes to mind when you think of him these past 2 days?
Yeah, that's in all honesty, so many. I remember once being invited to his sukkah with somebody who's now actually also a leader of a major Jewish institution, the London School of Jewish Studies, Dr. Rabbi Dr.
Right.
Raphael Zarum. And I don't even recall what it was about particularly, but we were both invited and we went to his sukkah. And it always amuses me to think there's nothing more quintessentially Anglo-Jewish than the three of us sitting in his sukkah, drinking a cup of tea with milk. And it's just a very fond memory. But I think that one of the strongest memories is that Rabbi Sacks used to have an annual program on the BBC, and it was a Rosh Hashanah message. And every year it would be on late night in the week running up to Rosh Hashanah, where there would be his Rosh Hashanah message that he would record. And in 1998, he invited me to be one of the people that he would be interviewing for that message. And he was interviewing a judge, a doctor, an actor, and a teacher, an educator. And just to look at how Jews in the UK are spread across our life in kind of culture and industry and all around. And so the show was made up of him interviewing these different people, and I was the educator. And it was always very amusing to me and my wife, who, when it was shown, and we did our interviews and spent a wonderful day at the Millennium Dome, which was this grand structure being built in the UK for the millennium, and it was going to have a faith part of it. So Rabbi Sacks was very keen to promote that. So we were there in our hard hats because it was still a building site going up, and we walked around there and he conducted this interview with me. The other people, one was a judge, one was a famous Jewish comedian or actress, her name's Maureen Lipman. One was Lord Robert Winston, who is an extremely famous medical man who was created test tube babies, I believe, in England, was a kind of incredibly important fertility doctor. And little me. And at the end of the show,
Quite young at the time.
I would have been what? Gosh, yeah, not even 30. But that really, speaks to the kind of influence he had, because there were these great luminaries and there was little me. But his desire to promote, a cadre of young Jewish leaders, grew to the extent that he would have a non-entity such as me on the Rosh Hashanah message, and at the end, where he's doing his voiceover summing up, and my wife would always said she imagines people watching this and hearing that Judge Irving and Dr. Winston and Maureen Lipman and Daniel Reinhold, at which point everyone's like, who? So I always recall that with a smile. But as I say, that really does speak to that desire to promote and inspire that generation. And as I said at the beginning, so many of them now are out there.
I'm sure he was very proud of your achievements and will remain proud of your future achievements. But a final question, which I ask you as in your wearing your hat, your day job as a professional philosopher, as somebody who's engaged in the history and impact of ideas in the Jewish world. In 100 years from now, people will still be reading the writings of Jonathan Sacks. What will be his legacy to those future readers, thinkers, scholars, Jew and Gentile alike?
Well, I hope that his legacy remains much in the way that I mentioned before, that there is a power and an importance to understanding one's own faith in one's own terms without reductionism or apologetics, but to maintain that uniqueness without it yielding isolation in such a way that as he himself put it, God is universal, religions are particular. So to be able to maintain that identity proudly, strongly, unapologetically, and yet do so in a way that you can still be integrated and contribute to the important conversations that are going on. I think I would like to hope that that will be part of his legacy that will remain.
Dr. Daniel Reinhold of Yeshiva University, thank you for helping us absorb the shock, make some sense of the significance of this great man of whom we are bereft. We should all turn our mind and our attention to his many writings, which will be worthy of our study for years and years to come. I remind our listeners you can visit the archives of traditiononline.org to read some of his essays, from his very first piece of published writing to an essay we published just last year, an overview of the book of Deuteronomy, in which he explores how it serves as a roadmap to covenantal society. Thank you very much.